Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. And let me say how happy I am to be here this evening with you. And in fact, you started by saying that we needed a bigger boat if we are going to do what we need to do. In the terms of the UN, that bigger boat means reform, it means change, it means getting the governments to work together. And I will tell you, I tried as Secretary General when I launched a comprehensive reform of the UN, and 6 weeks later, somebody managed to get a piece into the New York Times complaining that I had not reformed the UN and its agencies in 6 weeks flat. And I used to have monthly lunches with the Security Council, and that day we were having one of those lunches. So I started by apologizing for my failure to reform the UN in 6 weeks. And Sergei Lavrov, who is today the Russian's foreign minister and the only communist in the room, invoked the Bible and God. He said, "Mr. Secretary General, what are you complaining about? You've had more time than God had to create the world." And I said, "Mr. Ambassador, you are right. But God had a unique advantage. He worked alone." Without a Security Council or a General Assembly, and from a clean canvas. It is indeed a pleasure for me to be here, and Canada has been one of the staunchest supporters of the United Nations. And in my career at the United Nations, I had the opportunity to work with wonderful, dedicated, competent Canadians who made real contribution to the organization and to our world. Men like General Romeo Dallaire, Lloyd Axworthy, who was a foreign minister and worked with me on the responsibility to protect. Louis Arbour, who became High Commissioner for Human Rights. Louise Fréchette, whom I appointed as the first ever UN Deputy Secretary General. And there was an interesting story about this, because when I pushed to get the post created, and it took a while, when the post was created, I kept saying, "When she comes." And the ambassadors would say, "When he comes." And so it was when she comes, when he comes. In the end, they realized I was stubborn and determined to appoint a woman. So they gave up and said, "When is she coming and who is she?" It became, Louise Fréchette. I've had people like Stephen Lewis, Maurice Strong, Yves Fortier work with me on many UN projects. And of course, your able and wonderful ambassadors, Bob Fowler, Hein Becker, Alain Rock, and many countless Canadians who have worked for us at headquarters and in the field. This is just a few of the wonderful Canadians who worked with me when I was Secretary General. And as you've seen in the book, I'm looking at intervention in a much broader context. Intervention does not mean military action, as sometimes people think it is. We live in a common village, common global village, and there are problems which affect us all. And we need to tackle them and deal with them and intervene to make sure the village stays safe and healthy. It may be a question of disease. It may be the avian flu. It may be HIV/AIDS. We have to intervene. And this is why we set up the Global Fund to fight HIV/AIDS. It may be a question of poverty, a question of famine, a question of earthquake or tsunami. We intervene as an international community to help. And it's not always easy when you try to challenge people to do things. I recall a conversation I had with he's still very much there, with President Mugabe of Zimbabwe, trying to encourage him to join the fight against HIV/AIDS, to encourage his people to use condoms, because we were really worried about this. And he looked at me. He said, "Mr. Secretary General, you shouldn't be talking about condoms. You shouldn't even mention the word." I said, "It's very important." And knowing he was a very keen Catholic, brought up in a Jesuit school, I shared with him the fact that I had even raised this issue with the Pope. He looked at me and said, "Mr. Secretary General, when it comes to condoms, the Pope and I are one." And he tied his hands like this. I said, "But our people are dying." And he wasn't the only one. Former President Moi of Kenya had to make a speech, and he was given a statement. And that statement had him recommending people to be careful, to protect themselves, to use condoms. For 2 weeks, they couldn't convince him to do it. He said, "I'm the father of the nation. I'm supposed to be encouraging them to be morally upright. Why are you asking me to go and preach promiscuity to my own people?" That was the atmosphere when we were dealing with the question of the HIV/AIDS. But in the end, we did intervene, we did succeed. We did intervene not only with the African governments, but with Western governments who provided resources for to fight the disease. In fact, the first check I got for the establishment of the Global Fund to fight HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis came from President Bush, without question. And subsequently, he himself set up a program that envisages $5 billion a year. We got the pharmaceutical company. We intervened with them to reduce the cost of medication, so that the poor could afford it. And I told them quite frankly, if you want to protect your intellectual property, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to do that in a world where medication is available, can save lives, but the poor have to die because they can't afford it. And that was one of the strongest arguments against the regime that existed at the time. And at that time, they had taken Mandela to court in South Africa because he was threatening to use compulsory licensing to produce generic version of the medication. I met with chairman of the 7 largest pharmaceutical companies to intervene with them. We met in Amsterdam, appealing to them to do something about this. And I said, look, you can go ahead and sue Mandela, but it's a lost cause. To sue Mandela in South Africa on an issue like HIV/AIDS, and the fact that he's trying to take steps to protect his people, I said, if you lose, you lose, and lose, and lose. And if you win, you lose. So why are you taking this case to the courts? Anyway, in the end, they settled out of court, but the intervention brought the medication down. At that time, it was about $15,000 a year. Eventually, today, it's about $150, which the poor can afford. And medication like nevirapine, mother-to-child transmission, was given free of charge. So that is a form of intervention that the book deals with. Often people ask me, or recently they asked me, why did you write the book? I wrote the book because I have had the privilege and the good luck of leading a very interesting life, leading the United Nations as Secretary General, and I felt that there were experiences I have lived that I should share, otherwise the lessons are lost. I felt the UN is an essential organization, not perfect, and the staff of the UN, people who work there, are like you and me. They are no saints, and they are not superhuman beings. Sometimes we expect too too much of them, and we do not lower expectations, and we don't even tell our stories. We can't tell our stories, even the successful ones. And so I thought perhaps through my own experience, I can make public what goes on within the walls of the UN and how we tackle the problems of the world. And I have tried to do an honest biography, honest account of what I lived. And that is not always easy, because you also have to be sensitive to people that you may hurt who are still in service. I began life in Ghana. I entered adulthood at a time when Ghana was going through its independence struggle. And it was a fascinating period. Change was in the air. You could feel the political electricity. We were teenagers and young. We heard the older ones debate, discuss why we need independence. Some were in a hurry. Some felt it should be step by step. We at school sometimes played the role, taking sides. I'm in the opposition, you are with the government, and we will debate those issues. And I grew up with a sense that change is possible. When you live it as a teenager, seeing a whole system change. Suddenly, the British governor was gone. The British head of the army is gone. The police commissioner, the head of government business is Ghanaian. And you can see all these changes, and you grew up saying, gosh, change is possible. Even the most fundamental change is possible. So you go through life determined to make a difference, determined to change things. And we, as young men, all wanted to get education and make a difference and help build our countries. I entered the UN at a young age, and I saw the changes that the world went through, particularly the end of the Cold War, which brought dramatic changes to our peacekeeping operations. Until 1989, the UN peacekeeping operations were limited to conflict between states, and between states which had signed a peace agreement, and the peacekeepers went in lightly armed to monitor the agreements they have signed. After the Cold War, when Gorbachev came up with his perestroika and glasnost, suddenly there was a feeling at the UN that after all, the organization can now do what it was designed to do, take firm decisions and try and ensure that the world we live in was peaceful. And so for the first time, they asked one of my predecessors to come up with a recommendation as to how we can strengthen peacekeeping or what changes should be wrought. One of the changes that came into being was the fact that we could do peacekeeping in civil war. Until then, we had not. It was only either between Israel and Egypt, and countries where there were clear lines, two governments, two clear armies that you're dealing with. After that, the Council took decisions, and we were involved in situations of civil war. From Somalia to Rwanda to Bosnia to Kosovo, and today we are in Syria, we were in Angola and Namibia. And whilst we got involved in civil wars, we never really worked through some of the challenges that meant, where it was messy and you had to do with the fluid and the unpredictable. And in some situations, you had to go in with force, overwhelming force. We used to say if we had overwhelming force, to show force in order not to use force. It sounds like a contradiction, but if you arrive in an impressive mode, they wouldn't take you on. Usually they back off. If you come in lightly armed and you are perceived as weak, they take you on. And in the civil war situations, often that was the case with us. And so we went through some very challenging times in Rwanda, in Bosnia. Kosovo was another example. And of course, apart from this peacekeeping, and as I indicate in my book, we had to intervene in humanitarian situations. And Kosovo was one of the crises that really challenged us. We had lived through Yugoslavia. We saw what happened in Srebrenica when 8,000 men were marched away and killed. And the same leader, Milosevic, was engaged in Kosovo. Did we have to sit back and wait to let him do what he did in Srebrenica before we intervened? So it became there was a very big debate at the UN where the Western powers wanted to intervene. They knew the Russians were opposed to it, and therefore bypassed the Security Council and took action in Kosovo. I, as Secretary General, was placed in a very difficult situation, but I came out in favor of that action, arguing that there are times when force could be put to the service of peace, and that it was legitimate. Of course, that caused me some anguish with the Russians and the Chinese, but that was a Rubicon that the UN crossed. And with these operations, each one is different. In East Timor, where the Indonesians had taken the territory after the Portuguese withdrew, there had been almost I was going to say a civil war, a confrontation between the two groups, East Timor and Indonesia, for 25 years. And when I became Secretary General, we had been negotiating for a long time, and I thought that was one crisis we should try and deal with, because it brought tensions between East Timor and Indonesia, and tensions between Indonesia and Australia, because it was lying between the two states, and there was oil also in the offshore between the two countries. We had a very interesting situation where we had been negotiating with the Portuguese and the East Timorese for a while, and we got them to a stage where they agreed that there will be a popular vote. Originally, the Indonesians said, we will offer a popular vote to the East Timorese to vote on joining Indonesia as an autonomous state, but they wanted independence. In the end, we got both parties to agree that there will be a vote. There will be a vote for self-determination and independence. And I think we managed to get them to agree to the vote, because each side was convinced it was going to win, which was fine as for me as a negotiator. At least they agreed to move forward. When the vote was taken, the East Timorese voted almost 90-something% for independence, which was a shock for Indonesia. And the Indonesian troops attacked the East Timorese, burnt buildings and facilities. And then, of course, we had to try and do something to protect them. But even here, to manage to do something to protect them, we needed the consent of the Indonesian government, because the countries in the region who were offering troops said they will only go in if they are invited by Indonesia. And the ASEAN countries tend to be very jealous of their independence and sovereignty. I had managed to convince Australia to lead the force. So I had the lead nation, but I had no troops. And so I entered into a long conversation with President Habibie, who was president at the time. And none can tell I was working the phones on both sides. When we ended the day in New York, they were waking up. So I'll get on the phone with him and telling him, Mr. President, you have to allow the international community to come in and help. Otherwise, you're going to be held responsible for what happens. He said, all is calm. My soldiers are telling me that nobody is burning anybody's property. It's Indonesians who are leaving, who are frustrated and did not want to leave their cars and their houses for the East Timorese, so they are burning their own houses. I said, Mr. President, that is not the story I'm getting. We sent in the Security Council and they came up with the same thing. Finally, he agreed he would accept help. And then we were able to get troops from the region to go in and put the situation under control. We have had lots of problems in Africa, as you've seen, lots of peacekeeping operations. But today we can say that there are less civil wars in the world today than there were a decade or 15 years ago. And of course, with the end of some of these conflicts, whether in Namibia, in Angola and others, comes a certain sense that they have to work on economic and social issues if they are going to look after their people and develop the continent. There has been decisions taken by the African Union, for example, that they will not accept anybody who comes to power by force, that the generals should go back to the barracks and they will not be invited to join the League of African Heads of States. And that was a very bold decision. I challenged them when I first appeared before them that they should not accept this. And 2 years later, it had become a norm, with the end result that today most of the generals are back in the barracks, and in situations where it happens that some crazy guy takes power, he's not able to go and sit with them as the head of state with equal authority. I can go on for a while, we don't have much time, but let me say that today we are all watching the situation in the Middle East. I had lots of work done in the Middle East. I worked with the Israelis to withdraw the Israeli troops from southern Lebanon and encourage the governments to put in troops in southern Lebanon, which ended the war between Lebanon and Israel. Later on, I had to work with President Assad of Syria on instructions from the Security Council to withdraw all his forces. He had lots of troops, thousands of troops in Lebanon, to withdraw the troops from Lebanon and the security apparatus in Lebanon, which finally allowed the Lebanese to assert their own independence. Today we are still involved in Syria. We are involved in Syria on the account of I would even call it part of the Arab Spring, because the crisis in Syria started as a grassroots political movement by people demanding a say in how they are governed and who governs them. And when the government turned its guns on them, the opposition also took arms. And this conflict has also attracted quite a lot of jihadist elements, including Al-Qaeda, into the war in Syria. And Syria is a very sensitive country. It's a country that has many different groups. It has the Alawites, who are Shia. You have the Sunnis, you have the Druze, you have the Christians, you have the Kurds, you have the Assyrians, and you have the Turkmen, all sharing this beautiful land. And it is perhaps Aleppo and Syria have been one of the continuously settled city in the world. It's an ancient land with lots of history. Today, Aleppo and Damascus are being bombed. They are destroying the country. But what is even more important, they are destroying that tapestry, that mosaic, which is Syria. I don't see a military solution. Even if one side wins, the others will not give up. We often focus on Shia and Sunni, but the different minorities that I've referred to constitute about 40% of the population. And we have a situation today where we are focusing so much on the armed groups, the two armed groups, that we forget the people in the middle, the minorities I've referred to, and the political voices that started the revolution. And we need to find a way of giving them voice and bringing them back. My own view, as I've indicated, any further militarization of the conflict is going to cause so much havoc. The Syrians are going through so many traumas that we need to find a way of explaining to the protagonist that there is another way. There is another way if we can demonstrate to them that there can be a political settlement, a political settlement that would ensure the interest of all groups and protect them. And it is not going to be a winner-takes-all situation. And with that alternative, maybe we stand a chance. But unfortunately, there are such divisions. Divisions within Syria, divisions in the region, with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey supporting the opposition, Iran on the side of the government. And at the international level, we have the divisions too, in the Security Council, looking at the permanent five. The three Western countries have a different approach: US, France, and UK, and China and Russia are on the other side. I went to Moscow to discuss this with President Putin in July, and their attitude is, we were duped in Libya, that they did not vote against the resolution. They abstained because the resolution demanded that the international community goes in to protect the people, because Gaddafi was threatening them, and they saw tanks moving towards Benghazi. The Russians and the Chinese felt they were duped because that mandate of protecting the people morphed into a regime change very quickly. And they felt the international community took sides in a civil war and got rid of the leader, and they don't want to see this happen in Syria. The Russians also believe that Syria and the Middle East is very close to them. It's more or less their backyard. And they also have an Islamic problem. And that what happens in Syria will have impact in their region. And go on to say that the US is far away with two oceans on either side. And therefore, they don't see the things the way we do. They also admit that they are not married to Assad. They accept that Assad can go. But their biggest fear is a chaotic collapse, the sort of thing we saw in Iraq. On the 30th of June, I organized a meeting in Geneva where I brought in the foreign ministers of the 5 permanent members, Secretary of State Clinton, Sergei Lavrov, Yang of China, Hague of UK, and Laurent Fabius of France, in addition to the ministers from Qatar, Kuwait, and Iraq, and the Secretaries General of the Arab League and the UN. We agreed a communique, which I would encourage you to look at, a communique that accepted that what we need is political transition. All 5 agreed. It went further to discuss what political transition means and argue that it will entail a transitional government with full executive powers. It will entail that the security forces be given competent top leadership so that they can ensure security when the change comes, whilst we also continue to ensure that governmental institutions worked, which also meant when once you say that you need an interim government with full executive powers, it means Assad must move on. And for the first time, all 5 of them signed on. And I had expected them to come to New York and build on that, because it was quite an achievement. But they came to New York and started fighting again, and yet, if you accept the fact that there is no military solution, but you are not pursuing the political settlement, then what is going to happen is the parties have to fight each other either to a draw until they are tired, or one wins, or one gives a knockout punch. Today, I don't think either side is in a position to give that knockout punch, which will mean that we are going to have a protracted war with many thousands killed. I may be wrong, but this is what worries me. And it will not only be a sectarian war in Syria, it is a war that can spread across the borders. We are already seeing the tensions in the neighboring countries, from Turkey to Jordan to Lebanon, and soon we'll be hearing about Iraq too. And it is extremely worrying, because this is one of the most volatile regions in the world, and in geopolitical terms it's also a very important area where we get lots of resources, oil and others from, but everybody is being pulled in. And so I would hope that the international community will wake up, discover that they have lots of common interest, and they can work together to protect these common interests and save the Syrians, or continue on this path, which I consider destructive competition, and everybody will be a loser. I think I'll pause here and take your questions. Thank you.